On an ordinary day in the 6th century BC, somewhere between 570 and 554 BC, an ancient coppersmith named Perele was joyously driving along the Sicilian roads. He was on his way to the palace of Phalaris and, importantly, was not going there empty-handed. The craftsman was in a hurry to deliver one of his most notable works, a large copper bull. Whether Perele created this bull on his initiative as a gift to the tyrant Acroninium, or whether it was commissioned from the palace itself, is difficult to say today. However, the purpose of this piece is reasonably well known. The bull was to be a sophisticated instrument of execution. The brass animal had a unique window in its body through which a person was placed inside. The bull was supposed to be heated from the outside once the unfortunate person was inside. As a result, the condemned man would be roasted alive on the red-hot copper. But that wasn't all. His cries would come out of the mouth of the copper bull and resemble the mooing of a real animal. Perele must have been delighted with his work, for not every artisan could boast of such originality. And so, having arrived at the palace with his workpiece, the coppersmith hurried to Phalaris, probably expecting praise and reward, and the ruler was indeed pleased with the work. Only as a reward, he ordered Perele to be placed inside the bull. After all, the invention had to be tested on someone. Since then, the brass bull has become one of the most horrible punishments humanity has ever managed to invent. Tales of it proved so frightening that it has survived to the present day and made the device a household name. Although some historians sometimes cast doubt on the case of Phalaris and Perelius, most still tend to believe that this is what happened. And if you look at the other terrible tortures that men of the past have devised, Phalaris's cruelty no longer seems so unreal. For example, the people of the Kingdom of Israel understood centuries before they created the copper ox that metals were suitable for punishment, but they uniquely used them. In the 9th and 10th centuries BC, molten lead was a common punishment at the height of the kingdom. Mostly, they inflicted this punishment on those accused of adultery and other similar crimes. The process began with strangulation, with the logic of the inhabitants of the Kingdom of Israel raising some questions today. There was a requirement that the rope of strangulation is soft enough not to cause unnecessary suffering to the person. After the first stage, when the unfortunate man was almost suffocating, hot lead was poured down his throat. Given this fact, he hardly had time to pay attention to the degree of softness of the rope. There are reports that 18th century executioners were not far behind their past counterparts. Their great invention was the so-called Iron Maiden. Looking at this device, we can assume that it was inspired by the copper bull of Perelius, among others. The small iron cabinet, remotely resembling a human figure, was intended for executions and torture. Those unfortunate enough to find themselves inside the Iron Maiden were faced with a multitude of long, sharp nails protruding from the walls of the gadget and piercing the unfortunate's flesh as the front doors closed. The Iron Maiden is often attributed to the Middle Ages, making an already brutal period in history all the more brutal. However, historians have proved that the first such device didn't appear until the 18th century, and no credible evidence of its use has ever been found. But the very fact that it existed at all is already quite terrifying. However, the Middle Ages got along just fine without the Iron Maiden. Imagine, a cart pulls up in one of the city squares, only it's not loaded with goods or hay. There's a cage on it, and inside a naked man. Soon, that cage will be taken down from the cart and left right there in the broad square. People will walk by as if nothing has happened, going about their usual business and occasionally laughing mockingly at the poor man sitting behind the iron bars. And all this will go on until the alleged offender, enduring humiliation, hunger, and thirst, finally admits guilt, even if he is not guilty, or dies from all this suffering. Around the same period, but a little further north, the Vikings, if ancient texts are to be believed, also showed considerable imagination in devising all sorts of punishments. One of the harshest kinds of execution was the so-called bloody eagle. According to the descriptions, the procedure involved making 2 incisions in the back of the unfortunate man, breaking and removing his ribs. The broken bones were shaped into wings, after which they sometimes put the convict's lungs on top of them. As a result of this manipulation, the person would, of course, die. As in the case of the Iron Maiden, no evidence has been found that they used such execution, but the descriptions of the procedure already make one wonder how cruel our ancestors could have been. Perhaps the most shocking tradition of early medieval Europe was the use of cruel procedures not even for punishment, but merely for a trial. The determination of a person's guilt or innocence turned out to be entirely a matter of chance, and there was certainly no question of any justice at all. Hot iron was applied to alleged criminals, witches, and other undesirables, claiming no innocent person would be left with a burn. Some were thrown into icy water, believing that he who had a clear conscience would go down. Of course, in most cases, the laws of physics and simple logic were not on the side of the defendant. As a result, almost all such test cases turned out to be actual executions. It is fair to say that Europe was not alone in distinguishing itself in the craft of inflicting suffering. The ancient East, too, was not the most merciful to those who broke the law or dared to trespass on the honor of a respected ruler. On a certain day in the late 5th century BC, the king of the First Persian Empire, Artaxerxes II, held a feast. There were also many warriors at this feast, and at first all went well. But at one point, a soldier called Mithridates, drunk on wine, suddenly took offense at the king and betrayed his trust. What precisely the soldier did, history is silent. Still, it was something terrible, for afterwards, Artaxerxes II ordered Mithridates to be subjected to Scaphism, one of the most horrible punishments ever seen. The guilty warrior was seized, taken to shallow water, and soon placed in a box of 2 boats attached. The body of the one condemned to execution was inside the boats, with only his arms, legs, and head left outside. But the most terrible thing began next. The executioners poured honey and milk over the exposed parts of the warrior's body, and then began to force-feed him the same foods. Soon the real suffering began for Mithridates. The honey and milk on his skin attracted flies and other insects, which covered his body with their bites, and the diarrhea that began from such feeding caused various parasites to appear inside the boat. With each passing day, things got worse. According to some records, the warrior lasted about 17 days before passing away. In the South and Southeast Asia, the executioners and rulers of antiquity also devised their unique method of punishment. In fact, they didn't even have to invent anything. The tools needed for execution were already in plain sight. Elephants. What could be more powerful and terrifying for a defenseless man? It was a general procedure in ancient India. The guilty man was thrown under the feet of the enraged animals, and then nature did its work. The strongest would win. And usually, of course, it wasn't the man. Some sources claim that elephants were even trained to be as cruel as possible. Despite the cruelty and savagery of this method, it only came to an end at the end of the 19th century. Those unfortunate enough to have been seriously wronged in ancient China were subjected to equally original punishments. One of the ordinary punishments was the Ling Chi, which means death by 1,000 cuts. In its severity, this execution surpassed many other punishment methods that existed. First, society's criminal, or someone deemed guilty, was tied to a pole. Leaving the person motionless, the executioners slowly cut the skin and removed it in pieces. The unfortunate man would be stripped of large portions and sometimes even whole body parts in the process. If the convict did not die of horror, pain, and blood loss before the procedure was over, the result of Ling Chi was beheading. Some sources claim that they used a similar punishment in other countries, including ancient Rome, Ottoman Empire, and in England. It is almost impossible to confirm or deny this today, but on the whole, these speculations seem to be quite honest. The execution lasted even longer than the Indian elephant crush. The Chinese authorities didn't officially ban its use until about 1905. Another subtle Chinese punishment was the so-called waist chop. The Chinese government has also taken steps to ensure that the punishment is carried out effectively. In the 3rd century BC, writer, philosopher, and chancellor of the Qin dynasty, Li Si was politically active and prominent in society. In about 208 BC, Zhao Gu, a powerful eunuch of the Qin dynasty, became the country's new ruler. Li Si becomes an enemy of the new ruler instantly, and the only future that awaits him is execution. Like many other ancient rulers, Zhao Gu was not known for his humanity and preferred eliminating his opponents by the harshest means. So for Li Si, they chose the Taila execution method. First, the brutal Gao ordered the unfortunate man to be subjected to the 5 pains, which resulted in his nose, feet, and other body parts being chopped off. The climax of his torment was the waist itself. The executioner cut Lin Si in half at the waist, inflicting an agonizing death. For as long as humanity has existed, many harsh methods of execution have been devised. Many of them will probably never cease to amaze us with their cruelty. We should be glad that almost all of them are in the distant past. and make sure they never happen again. If you know of even more horrific execution procedures, write about them in the comments. Subscribe to our channel to be the first to see new videos.